I should begin today by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Bundjalung country up in the top right-hand corner of the state. We acknowledge that First Nations peoples were the original custodians of the land and pay respects to elders past and present. And we also acknowledge that many First Nations peoples have survived modern slavery or practices that today would constitute modern slavery, and they continue to live with its legacies. And we think that's important to acknowledge here in Australia, in New South Wales, because there can be a tendency at times to think that modern slavery is something that happens to other people entirely outside Australia. But that's not the case. If we could come on to the next slide, please, Lucy. There are a number of different aspects of modern slavery. We'll touch on those shortly. Then I'm going to talk to you about the legal reforms in New South Wales and how they affect state-owned corporations. I'll talk to you about the shared implementation framework that we've developed and recently published through my office to help you with implementing the measures you need to meet your new legal obligations. We'll talk about reporting and implementation and what that looks like. And finally, at the end, we'll just touch briefly on a couple of new codes of practice that are under development that may be relevant to at least some of the organisations on the call. Next slide, please. And the next one. So there are 50 million people enslaved currently worldwide, according to the International Labour Organization. About 28 million of those are in commerce. So they're in private forced labour or state-sponsored forced labour, in supply chains or in domestic service contexts all around the world in a variety of different forms of exploitation. 22 million of the 50 million are in forced marriage. And that may be relevant for you in some ways. Perhaps some of your employees are exposed to that in some uncommon way, but most of what we tend to focus on in terms of managing modern slavery risks in operations and supply chains in the commercial context is really around forced labour type offences. Forced labour, debt bondage, deceptive recruiting, other such offences under federal and New South Wales law. There can be risks in some commercial organisations' own operations. For example, in New South Wales, we see modern slavery risks in the cleaning sector. We also see it in certain parts of domestic agriculture. But unless you're providing those services, then we're probably talking about modern slavery in your supply chains or potentially downstream of your services. This is all very costly, of course, costly to victims. Modern slavery causes immense psychological and indeed medical harms to its victims, but that has knock-on effects also for the economy more broadly. The current caseload in New South Wales, based on the best available estimate, is about 16,400. So that's about 40% of the 41,000 victims thought to be in modern slavery. If we use a methodology developed by the United Kingdom's Home Office to calculate the cost of that caseload, it works out at about $9.6 billion in lifetime costs from those 16,000 cases to the New South Wales economy. So there's a socioeconomic argument here for prevention and for intervention as much as anything else. The definition in New South Wales is provided in Schedule 2 of the Modern Slavery Act, and it picks up a variety of other offences, which we'll come on to in just a moment. The conduct doesn't have to occur in New South Wales, so something can be a modern slavery offence even if it occurs elsewhere. If that conduct, were it to occur in New South Wales, would be a modern slavery offence. And the recurring theme across all of these offences that we'll come on to a moment is one person being treated as if they were owned by another. So it's obviously not legal anymore to own someone as it used to be historically, but now we still have people and organisations treating other people as if they owned them. We're also seeing a number of important developments as organisations seek to grapple with these risks. And a number of these have been flagged in the modern slavery statements that your organisations are making under the Federal Modern Slavery Act. Development of employee and supplier training, creation of internal modern slavery working groups, which, as we know from your introduction, several of you sit on or represent, and commitments to respecting human rights in different ways. But what we're going to do today is we're going to walk you through in more detail the more granular expectations that are now in place in New South Wales. Next slide, please. This is how we think of modern slavery in my office. So I'm a statutory officer. I report to New South Wales Parliament, not to New South Wales Government. And my roles include monitoring for the effectiveness of efforts by government to address modern slavery, including in the procurement context. And when we think about how we measure effectiveness, we see modern slavery emerging out of the intersection of three factors. First of all, you have to have a vulnerable person. But what makes a person vulnerable is quite context specific. In some contexts, being a girl is enough to make you vulnerable to certain forms of exploitation. But that might depend on whether you're in a country where there's a strong legal, social and physical environment that prevents, for example, forced marriage, or whether you're in a place that doesn't effectively prevent that. In other places, it might be that disability is no particular vulnerability, but in some contexts, including here in Australia, it can make you vulnerable to certain forms of modern slavery. Being a migrant worker is very frequently a source of vulnerability because often that vulnerability intersects with restricted or limited access to supports, limited understanding of legal rights, limited ability to enforce those rights, which means that you're vulnerable to exploitation. And you always need that third element. You need somebody or a business model that takes advantage of the vulnerability and the person existing in a context where there are few safeguards, and then using that opportunity to actually undertake the exploitation. Sometimes that exploitation may even occur behind closed doors or in very isolated settings. So modern slavery emerges out of those different contexts. And what that means is that there's a need to conduct due diligence into the vulnerability that arises at different parts of supply chains in order to understand as a buyer, was the product that I'm buying, product or service, was it potentially made or distributed with modern slavery at some point in the supply chain? Next slide, please, Lucy. So we're going to come on now and talk about the legal context in which all of your state-owned corporations are operating. So the New South Wales Parliament adopted legislation beginning in 2018 and culminating in 2021. That means that a number of organisations must take reasonable steps to ensure that goods and services procured by and for the agency are not the product of modern slavery, or they must report on the steps that they are taking. And this is the approach for state-owned corporations, that you must report on those steps. There are different reporting obligations for slightly different groups of entities covered by the Modern Slavery Act and related legislation. And for government sector finance agencies, there's a requirement to comply with procurement board directions. So the New South Wales Procurement Board is obviously something that applies to government agencies in particular and not to state-owned corporations. Those obligations kicked in on the 1st of July 2022. I would also flag that since that time, there has been a new modern slavery audit power available to the New South Wales Auditor General. So like me, the Auditor General is independent of executive government, and he, or until recently, she chooses which agencies within their jurisdiction to conduct modern slavery audits of. There haven't been any yet, but we anticipate that in the coming years there will be modern slavery audits. And the outgoing Auditor General recently made clear in testimony to New South Wales Parliament that she will treat the guidance on reasonable steps that we recently published in my office, and which we're going to talk to you about today, as essentially the auditable standard against which she will be auditing agencies if she audits them under this modern slavery audit power. Next slide, please. So many of you will already know the Federal Act, and I want to just explain the relationship between the Federal Modern Slavery Act and the New South Wales Modern Slavery Act. They have unhelpfully exactly the same name, Modern Slavery Act 2018, but one is Commonwealth for the federal level, one is New South Wales. They operate side by side and they don't overlap much, but where they do, it's quite important to understand how. So the Commonwealth Act is focused primarily on corporate due diligence. It does cover some Commonwealth government reporting. It doesn't cover New South Wales public entity reporting, but some of your organisations are already reporting under that Act. The New South Wales Act covers public sector entities, and in relation to state-owned corporations, it does two things. First of all, it requires state-owned corporations to report under the voluntary stream of the federal legislation if they are not already reporting. And secondly, it requires reporting in your annual report on the steps that you're taking to address modern slavery risks. I paraphrase slightly, but that's what it boils down to, which essentially means aligning with the guidance on reasonable steps that we're about to get on to. Now, there is guidance available for reporting under the federal legislation, and that sets out 7 criteria for reporting, which are fairly procedural. We also happen to have 7 reasonable steps. They're not directly aligned. They go more to the substance of the conduct that you must engage in order to be able to show that you're taking reasonable steps. But what I want to stress here is that those things are not incompatible. They're both dealing with the same underlying conduct and the same expectations that you align that conduct with Australia's international commitments to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the almost identical, for our purposes, OECD due diligence. So the guidance that we've provided at the state level is designed to help you meet those standards of conduct, and you can be entirely sure that if you report that conduct under the federal legislation, that will be in conformance with expectations under the federal legislation. The form of reporting might be slightly different, but the underlying expectations of conduct are perfectly aligned. And that's a requirement on me in developing, in my executing my functions to align with the Federal National Action Plan. It is, however, worth being aware that the federal legislation is essentially under review. So there was a review performed by Professor Macmillan about a year ago, and we're awaiting a government response. The recommendations from that review suggested the establishment of a federal anti-slavery commissioner, and we're very close to a bill going through federal parliament that will do that. The dropping of the reporting threshold from 100 million to 50 million, and crucially, movement towards the adoption of substantive due diligence obligations. So not just reporting on what you're doing, but actually setting out some kind of standard as to what you should be doing and reporting against that. That's essentially where we are under the New South Wales law, that the reasonable steps obligation is a substantive due diligence expectation aligned with the UN Guiding Principles, and the guidance that we're about to show you helps you achieve that expectation. But it's worth keeping an eye on the federal process over the next year or two, as that legislation may develop to make all of this more clear. There has been a review of the New South Wales Act. It continues in the New South Wales Modern Slavery Committee in Parliament. It's worth mentioning that committee. It's a standing committee of both houses of New South Wales Parliament, and that's important to be aware of because it means that there's a group within the Parliament that's going to maintain an ongoing focus on modern slavery issues, including as they relate to procurement by government entities and state-owned corporations. So I might come on to the next slide. Before I do, are there any questions to this point, including on the relationship between the federal and the New South Wales laws?
James, it's Andrea from Water New South Wales. Just a quick question. Given there's so much overlap between the Commonwealth and New South Wales, if following the review they're exactly the same or so close, will we still continue to need a separate act within New South Wales?
Probably, yes. We're certainly keen to see conformity or even harmonisation, and where there's certainly awareness at both the New South Wales and federal levels that it would be good, for example, to work towards a single reporting arrangement for the very limited number of entities that are caught by both acts. But the framework in New South Wales needs to align with existing, for example, New South Wales government procurement framework, and the language used there is bespoke to New South Wales. Similarly, the language used for the federal government entities is bespoke to their particular procurement environment. So I think there'd still be a need for some differentiation there. The other thing is that the Modern Slavery Act in New South Wales gives me a wide variety of functions and mandates that we're not even going to be talking about here today, that are not in any way addressed by the Federal Act. For example, I have an obligation to identify and provide assistance and support to survivors of modern slavery. There's no equivalent of that currently at the federal level. So we work very closely with New South Wales government agencies on providing that support and assistance, but that isn't covered at the federal level.
Okay, thank you.
Avi?
Thank you. Like I looked at it a few years ago, and I remember at the time, between the New South Wales and the Commonwealth law, there were distinctions along the spend threshold, and I think the New South Wales law also had provisions to start penalizing people who were not able to report on things. Has that been incorporated into the final law, or has it been done away with?
That has been done away with. That is the best news you'll hear this afternoon, that there is no corporate due diligence reporting under the New South Wales law. It just happens because of your, as state-owned corporations, your rather unique status that you operate commercially, but you have certain roots in public law. You happen to be caught in a couple of ways by the New South Wales legislation. So there are about 18, 20 organisations that have obligations of reporting under both the federal and state laws. It's all of you on this call, these state-owned corporations, and then 10 universities that happen to be caught by both the federal and state law. And that's not irrelevant. It's worth looking to those universities as peer organisations in the sense of the fact that they're covered by both laws, but also that they're quite advanced in their thinking about how to manage modern slavery risks in complex supply chains and complex operational contexts. They have, for example, Australian Universities Procurement Network Modern Slavery Working Group that does a lot of work in this space. So if you're looking for other peers, and we'll talk some more later in the presentation about how to access good practice, but universities in New South Wales, the 10 universities based in New South Wales would potentially be good peers for you to reach out to for those learning opportunities.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. All right, we might plow on, but please chime in anytime, everyone. So we're going to come on now and talk about the shared implementation framework. So I took office on the 1st of August 2022, and I think it was that afternoon that I got my first email from an entity that has these obligations saying, what are reasonable steps? What is reasonable for one organisation may not necessarily be what's reasonable for another. Look at who we have on the call here. I think we have about 1,000 people from Water New South Wales, which is fantastic, but speaks to the scale and capability in your team and your level of engagement with this issue, which is to be commended. Whereas, as the Port Authority told us, they have a procurement team of 2. So I think you can see it stands to reason that what's reasonable for different organisations to do by way of due diligence is actually going to vary in part based on capability. But it's also going to vary, as we're going to come on and talk about, based on the riskiness of the transaction. What you need to do for a low risk transaction can't be the same as what you need to do for a high risk transaction. So that makes for a complex terrain here. What is reasonable is going to be quite context specific. So we began working with a wide array of entities that are covered by the law to develop what we call a shared implementation framework. It's shared in the sense that it's a framework that covers this cohort, state-owned corporations. It covers the universities we mentioned. It covers all New South Wales government departments. It covers all New South Wales councils, local councils. It covers all New South Wales local Aboriginal land councils. And it covers a whole bunch of other organisations that are established by public law or exercise public authority. Over 420 organisations have these obligations and are covered by this framework, with a combined annual procurement spend of at least 45 billion Australian dollars. You may not be aware that the New South Wales government is the largest employer in the Southern Hemisphere, and the New South Wales public sector is the second largest procurer in the Southern Hemisphere. And that's only behind the Commonwealth government, the Australian government. If you take defence spending out of the Australian government equation, New South Wales government is by far a bigger spender. So all of the spending on, goods and services in the local economy, that a lot of that is going to be a larger share of that is coming from the New South Wales government than from other public sector sources. So what New South Wales public buyers do on these issues is going to have an impact in the sector and on modern slavery risks generally. So we have developed this framework, which we're going to spend some time going through with you now. It's based on 5 different main areas or artifacts. The first is very substantial guidance, which we'll take you through shortly. The second is model contract clauses, which we'll also talk about. Then model tender clauses, an inherent risk identification tool, which we'll show you the basics of, and a public register, a register where I keep track of entities that are not meeting their modern slavery risk management and reporting obligations under the law. That register has not formally been published. It's very shortly going to be published. It is going to be either empty or very close to empty. If it's not entirely empty, it will be because a very small number of state-owned corporations may have missed one procedural element, and we'll be contacting them shortly. It's really a technical matter. Our view on the register is that obviously it is designed under the legislation as a name and shame mechanism, but we want to work with entities to develop the capabilities to manage risk over time. We're not going to rush into putting entities on the register. We'll work with entities to help them develop the capabilities to meet these expectations. As you can see in the lovely lavender boxes at the bottom of the slide, we already see examples from your modern slavery statements of things that some of you are already doing that go to some of the issues we're going to touch on in this framework. The framework is in addition supplemented by new guidance on reasonable steps resources, which you will be able to access through our website. They're linked to from that slide. And we'll have more and more of those developing and being made available through our website in coming months, including training materials and videos. We may also, in the framework, at times refer to certain codes of practice, and I'll come on to those later in the presentation. Next slide, please, Lucy. So this is what the guidance on reasonable steps looks like. You can follow the QR code if you want to get your phone out now to the guidance and download it. It's a hefty document. It's about 200 pages, so you might want to save it on your desktop and keep it there. This will be regularly updated. We are in version 1 at the moment, but we will be thinking about an update later this year to reflect what we learn about how this system is working and needs improvement, and to make it even more user-friendly. Next slide, please. So the guidance sets out 7 reasonable steps. The first is commit, and for each of these there are sub-steps. So commit is really about getting a modern slavery policy in place, a modern slavery risk management framework, engaging affected stakeholders, and undertaking a salient modern slavery risk analysis. There's extensive guidance available on what each of those things means in the document, and we'll talk a little bit about some of them in a moment. Next, planning, sourcing, and managing. So this means addressing modern slavery risks when you're thinking about how you're going to source goods and services in the first place. It may be that certain products, such as solar panels, it's very difficult currently to source products that you can be confident are modern slavery free. Now, in that situation, the legislation does not say thou shalt not buy. It requires you to put certain risk management arrangements in place. But as part of that, it's going to get you to start thinking about how over time do we as an organization intend to have a sourcing strategy that allows us individually or perhaps working in concert with others to start accessing a supply of solar panels that operate at a modern slavery risk that we are comfortable with. So that's the way in which this issue arises in the sourcing strategy and in planning your approach to market. Sourcing is then also relevant in terms of running tenders. We'll say a little bit more about that. Managing your contracts is going to be critical because modern slavery risks will crystallize in your supply chains. They happen. It's not that they don't happen, that we know with 50 million people in modern slavery worldwide, you're going to encounter it here and there. And so you need to have arrangements in place for what you're going to do when you encounter it. There's extensive guidance on that. There are expectations that you provide or enable effective remedy when modern slavery does occur. And exactly what that requires depends on your links to the resulting harms. And there's a lot of learning about that covered in the guidance. Then we cover reporting and finally continuous improvement. Next slide, please. For each of those steps, there's a chapter in the guidance which talks about a number of things. First of all, it specifies the data that you need to collect and report. So this is a bit different to the federal approach. The federal approach, those 7 criteria for reporting, are really about how you feel about the effectiveness of your approach and the kinds of things you're doing, and a pretty free form actually in how you report. We're a little bit more prescriptive in setting out the kinds of things we want you to report on to demonstrate the steps you're taking to meet those reasonable steps. None of this is particularly onerous, I should stress, as you'll see when you look at the reporting section of the guidance. But by prescribing what we expect you to report, what that allows is comparison year on year, so that you can see how your capabilities are developing and what kind of impact they're having, and comparison across different organizations so that there can be learning, and so that we as the system monitor can recognize where there are particular things that we need to help multiple organizations with, or particular areas of risk emerging that we need to help them address. In each case that we discuss a number of the different factors and considerations, we provide good practice examples, and we even provide hallmarks of what best practice looks like. And we provide references to further resources that you can go and explore if you need to understand a particular area in more depth. Next slide, please. There are a lot of appendices. There's 80 pages out of the 200 is appendices. And we show that here because we want you to know there's a lot of detail that you can dive into over time. Let me be clear that the expectation is not that you will somehow magically turn a key and tomorrow implement fully 200 pages of guidance. The expectation is that you use this as a resource to map out a pathway over the coming years and demonstrate through your reporting how you're moving along that pathway. So some of the resources in here are things that you're going to get into in the next couple of years as you encounter particular problems. For example, Appendix M talks about good practice in identifying forced labour. So you may have suppliers and you may begin to be worried that perhaps in a particular electronic supply chain there might be forced labour, and you may think, how are we going to check this? We need to hire a third-party audit company. But how do you know if that audit company is any good? You can come to Appendix M and see whether their approach lines up with the good practice in identifying forced labour set out in Appendix M. As perhaps then you identify that in your operations or supply chains, there might be potential victims of modern slavery, and you're trying to think about how do we engage with them. Appendix N would give you some pointers if you decide that is something you're going to do, about how you can do that safely and reliably and think through the steps you need to take to approach this. So lots and lots of resources for you to dive into. Next slide, please. As I said earlier on, what is reasonable depends on the capability and the riskiness, capability of the organization and the riskiness of the transaction. So we use this throughout the shared implementation framework to allow you to identify what level of diligence is due, whether it's heightened, standard, light, or minimal. Capability is not a subjective question. We set out various criteria by which you can assess your capability level objectively. And equally, the inherent modern slavery riskiveness of a particular transaction is not a subjective question. We provide a tool, which we'll come on to in a moment, to help you understand for any given product category, how inherently risky is this from a modern slavery perspective. I think I saw a hand briefly. Was there someone who wanted to jump in?
Sorry, James, that was by mistake.
No problem. All right. Next slide, please, Lucy. We might skip that one, Lucy, if that's all right. Thanks. One of the things that flows from identifying the level of diligence that is due is that you may need to take different approaches to contracting. Contracting is obviously critical because that sets up the framework by which you hold suppliers to account for taking steps to effectively identify and manage modern slavery risks. So we've provided two different model contract clauses, one for those procurements involving heightened modern slavery due diligence, and one for those that under our framework involve light, minimal, or standard due diligence. Obviously, the heightened one is a longer contract clause, and the guidance sets an expectation that that clause will be used in heightened modern slavery due diligence transactions, whereas for the other level of due diligence, the use of the streamlined version of the contract clause is optional. You should consider it a resource. Now, what's interesting about these contract clauses is that they move away from some of the existing practice that, while standard in Australia, is increasingly seen as outdated in commercial practice in North America and Europe. That's a practice that essentially asks suppliers to represent or warrant, in effect, to guarantee that they are not connected to modern slavery in certain specified ways. Different contract clauses specify that in different ways, but they're basically saying, promise us that you're not connected or that you're taking certain steps to address this. And if it turns out that that's not the case, then we have a right to terminate the contract. The problem with this approach is that what that leads to is de-risking from the perspective of the organization, the buyer. We find a supplier is connected to modern slavery, we cut ties, we de-risk. What it does not do is address the underlying modern slavery risk. It does not achieve the outcome, which is the entire intent, legislative intent of this framework that Parliament put in place, which is to actually try over time systemically to reduce modern slavery risk. What is required there is for buyers to stay and engage with suppliers where modern slavery risk is found, and to work with the suppliers to maintain the buyer-supplier relationship, but helping suppliers develop the capabilities to continue to supply the goods and services at fair value in a way that doesn't rely on modern slavery to produce and distribute those goods and services. So that's quite a different mindset. Now, the challenge in taking that approach is, well, who's responsible for what? What is the buyer's responsibility and what is the supplier's responsibility to address that, the underlying problems in that kind of situation? So the model contract clause sets out a shared responsibility approach that has been developed by the American Bar Association and others, and aligns with Australia's international commitments under the UN Guiding Principles and OECD due diligence. It essentially triggers, when there's a modern slavery incident occurring in a supplier-buyer relationship, it triggers a special regime that allows the two parties to work through who has what responsibilities and to work together to address the modern slavery risks. Now, if that fails, there is still a right of termination, and the other contractual remedies are not superseded here. But it sets out an expectation of continued engagement to manage down modern slavery risk, to try and remove it from the system overall. Next slide, please. I might just quickly touch on the tender clauses before I open up again for any questions, and then we'll go on to some other things. So alongside the contract clauses, we also provide model tender clauses that are based on overseas best practice, notably the approach being taken by UK Crown procurement. And these are designed to facilitate effective due diligence by the buyer on the tenderer. There are two different approaches taken here, again, heightened and other forms of modern slavery due diligence. And they approach how you factor modern slavery risk into the tender process in slightly different ways, either through a weighting or more through a threshold question type approach. So I'm just going to pause here and ask if there are any questions about the last few slides that we've covered.
I have a quick question.
Please.
Why do we follow the UK's example? UK is based in a very different geography compared to us. Like APAC is probably responsible for 80-90% of the world's modern slavery, whereas UK and Europe is probably responsible for less than 5%. Like, is there a reason we follow their model?
Well, when you think about where people are buying from, these days you're probably buying from supply chains that are quite global. So even if the underlying modern slavery is occurring not in the UK but offshore in Asia Pacific, for example, if you're buying computers, whether you're UK Crown procurement or Sydney Water or Port Authority, you're probably buying from ultimately from the same factories in Asia. So there's a lot of commonality in the modern slavery risk that you're exposed to. We also looked for examples of commercial practice that align with the way we approach things here in Australia, and there's quite a similar type of approach to procurement in the United Kingdom. The other thing I would mention, we don't get to mention this very often, is that actually the UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States a few years ago made a shared commitment to use public procurement to address modern slavery and human trafficking risks. So there is actually a platform or a basis for sharing and learning across those particular jurisdictions. But great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrea?
Hi, I can understand you following the UK, coming from the UK. Yeah, my question's around, obviously, a lot of the due diligence, we all use the same, if not similar suppliers. If we're all carrying out the same due diligence on the same suppliers, there's a cost to that in terms of time and money, and on the supplier as well. And I know in other industry, and I know at an industry level, there's a lot of collaboration, like the construction, where they, kind of tell us once type approach. But as New South Wales government, or even, Australian government, is there any initiatives to take that burden away? Because depending on the size of your agency as well, you don't always have the budget to kind of put good systems in place for mitigating risk of modern slavery, or the supplier, supply chain risk assessments and risk management. If you think of some of the bigger departments in New South Wales government, they've got a lot more capacity and a lot more, kind of budget to probably put into that. But if we took a more collaborative approach across government, councils, universities, SOCs and everything, surely we would lighten the burden on the suppliers, but at the same time get, kind of insights a lot quicker, the sharing of information, etc. Is there any initiatives to look at that? Because it must be an efficiency kind of outcome as well as a modern slavery outcome as well.
So, Andrea, I think you've struck at the heart of the matter there. That's certainly the approach we would like to encourage. And in fact, I would probably prognosticate a bit and say we think that that's the direction of travel here. So the New South Wales public procurement framework that government agencies operate under, you're probably aware, is quite devolved. So individual agencies, or what used to be called clusters, exercise a lot of discretion in how they go about procurement. There's overall frameworks that they operate within, but they do a lot of the decision making, and they, as a result, have quite a lot of capabilities at the agency level. What is very clear on modern slavery, for all the reasons you've just outlined so eloquently, Andrea, is that there would be benefits to having shared or even centralized capabilities in several areas: in risk analysis, potentially in supplier level due diligence, possibly in contract management, and in grievance mechanisms. So these are all areas that have come up numerous times in the process through which we developed this guidance. So I should have explained that the guidance was developed through extensive consultations over about a year with affected entities. What we've been able to deliver so far, given available resources and my mandate and how that interfaces with those existing legal frameworks, is central capability, particularly on risk analysis. We're going to come on in a moment to the tool that we've made available for a common approach to risk analysis. Supplier due diligence is a little bit more complex because sharing of information about suppliers runs into lots of commercial in confidence and other legal barriers, but it's certainly something that government agencies are looking at closely, even if, for example, it was initially around alignment of supplier questionnaires, so that suppliers are getting essentially one questionnaire that, instead of filling out lots of different questionnaires for lots of different buyers. What we are moving towards is there's a common platform used by a lot of government agencies in New South Wales called Buy.New South Wales, where suppliers can sign up. So we're about to integrate into that certain very simple light touch indications to suppliers when they're, for example, providing services in a high risk category, that they need to start getting across the guidance on reasonable steps and understanding how that may impact the tender process. And then also in data capture, when government agencies report certain contracts, that will be automatically populated with information about whether there's modern slavery risk as a result of, again, the procurement category that they're operating in. But on other areas like a common supplier platform or grievance mechanism, those are, I would say, those are matters for all of you as reporting entities to determine how you wish to proceed. It's not for me to tell you how to do that, but certainly we think collective approaches are likely to find you not only efficiencies, but improve effectiveness. And that's what we see happening in not only other sectors, but along value chains. So you'll see that the guidance in many areas says that the answer here is going to lie through collective action along the value chain. In certain areas, particularly those we're focusing on in our monitoring first around, for example, ICT or cleaning, we're focusing on those areas because they're high risk, but also there are initiatives already there in place that look at modern slavery risk along the value chain. So in the cleaning area, for example, there's an organisation called Cleaning Accountability Framework that brings together property organisations, unions, workers, and other relevant actors, including some financial organisations, to manage modern slavery risk in that space. In the ICT space, there's a similar organisation called Electronics Watch, which ensures that government buyers, public buyers, can understand through direct engagement with worker voice what the modern slavery risks are in the production of the ICT products that they're ultimately buying. So those kinds of solutions are emerging, but we think that there's definitely scope for all of you, whether acting as state-owned corporations or alongside any of the other entities that are covered, to think about what collaborative and collective solutions might look like in this regard. You are entirely at liberty to take those approaches, and if you want to pursue that in a particular area, we'd be very happy to provide advice and support. I see another hand. Can't quite see. It's Lan, I think.
Thank you. I have two questions. First being, has there been any appetite gauged from the supply chain to introduce usage of the model contract clauses into their procurement arrangements? And then as a second question in terms of relating to that, but not related, will the whole of government schemes be amended to introduce these model contract clauses?
Great, both great questions. So look, straightforwardly, I think the reaction of a range of stakeholders, both buyers and suppliers, to the model contract clauses is very variable. You know, it depends hugely on capabilities, the culture within organizations, the disposition of the senior leadership to issues like social risk. It's variable, and we'll continue to work with a range of stakeholders to encourage take up. The way that schemes and whole of government contracts work in New South Wales is that they're usually owned in a certain way by a particular agency. And so one of the responsibilities of those entities is to figure out what is it that falls under the guidance to the scheme owner and what is it that falls to the scheme user. So if users are arriving at a pool of approved suppliers, thinking these suppliers have already had due diligence performed on them, that would suggest that the modern slavery due diligence needs to be performed by the operator. But some scheme owners or operators may say, no, that's not the way we're going to do it for this scheme. So they'll be working through that over the coming years. We've begun already discussing with some of them how to do that. And we're in the process of working with a number of large government agencies to talk about what an implementation strategy might look like with all of them, and figuring out which of these schemes need to be prioritised. There'll be some schemes that are dealing with products that are high modern slavery risk. There'll be other schemes that really aren't connected to modern slavery risk, so they don't need to be prioritised at this point. So excellent question. Work in progress, I think, is the answer. If you're using a particular scheme or contract at the moment, I would get in touch with the owner and ask them what they're doing about this, because it's on them really, under the guidance and under the legal obligations, to figure out what their leverage is in this space and apply it accordingly.
Thank you.
Welcome then. All right, we might come on to the next slide. There's a few more to go. I think we've got you for about another 25 minutes or so. So this is the inherent risk identification tool. It's a little screenshot of something you can download from our website. This is a Excel workbook that allows you to look up a particular product category and find out how inherently modern slavery risky do we at the office think it is. Now, this is important because that will help you navigate that purple matrix that we looked at before. This is what tells you how risky the product is. Then you look at your own capabilities and organisation and you find out what level of diligence is due. We use here one of the New South Wales government procurement taxonomies. So there are about 375 product categories in that taxonomy. About 27, 28 of them are high risk. So those are the categories that we would think require modern slavery, heightened modern slavery due diligence. Now, what's also useful about this tool, I'm not sure if we have it on the next slide, but if you click on those links on the left hand on this slide, it'll take you through to a page for that particular product category. And on that page, it explains in a lot of detail, including all the original sources on which we rely, how we made the assessment that a particular category was at the particular risk level that we assign. And that's useful for you to understand, because you may look at a category and think, well, okay, the category is generators. That's where solar panels fall in this particular procurement taxonomy. But I'm not buying a solar panel. All of the sources here say this category is risky, seem to be referring to solar panels. I'm buying a diesel generator. Is that really risky? And you may then really high risk, and you may then form the view, while the category is high risk, actually the particular product we're buying is less risky. Therefore, we don't necessarily need to take heightened modern slavery due diligence. We can drop down to a lower level of due diligence. Equally, it could go in the other direction. You could see something that's particularly risky about the product you're buying. But what this does is it saves you a lot of time and potentially money, because you don't have to buy a commercial service to understand how risky these products are. It also means there's a common frame of reference across all of the 400 buyers, and what that are covered by our framework. And what that means is we'll be able to, we are able actually, we're beginning to see mapping of how risk is pooling across government contracting. And that will allow us then to say, okay, we're developing an area of risk in this particular supply chain. My office needs to put effort into helping people understand how to manage risk in that particular supply chain. So again, it's about that centralization and sharing of information, providing efficiency and effectiveness gains. Next slide, please, Lucy. So we define risk at the level 3 for the procurement specialists on the call, level 3 under the New South Wales taxonomy, but we do look down at level 4 in that taxonomy. So what that means is that the risk is essentially calculated aware of whether there might be modern slavery risk higher up in the supply chain, but the mere fact of modern slavery existing higher in the supply chain doesn't mean that everything downstream automatically becomes high risk. It depends on the proximity of where the modern slavery occurs to the product that you're buying ultimately. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the methodology is set out in detail in the IRIT itself. You're welcome to have a look at that. And if you have any questions on that, you're welcome to get in touch with us. It's available free. We'll update it. I think we're already on the 3rd version. It's version 1.1.2 or something like that. And we'll be doing a big update later this year, reflecting new research that's been done on certain products and actually recategorizing things, because there's been a recategorization under the New South Wales taxonomy, hopefully. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the last element of the framework is this register that we'll be publishing soon. It's currently empty, and as I said, although this is ultimately a naming and shaming mechanism, our view is that we need to work with entities to develop capabilities because we've set out a serious agenda of technical change and reform here. We need to give them time and space to develop those capabilities before we come into too much of the naming and shaming territory. Next slide, please. I'm going to say a little bit quickly about reporting and implementation. So the guidance is quite clear on what kinds of data needs to be collected and reported. That is reported both through your annual report, and we provide in Appendix K a table that you can use for that reporting. And then there's also an online form, which is identical to what's in Appendix K. So we are asking you to enter it in 2 places, but it's the same information. Now, the reason we do that is the statutory requirement is that it goes in your annual report, but by doing us the favour of entering it in the online form, you're going to allow us to be able to analyse that information much more rapidly, give you more helpful feedback and support, and as I said, see what's going on across the system and provide the necessary systemic reports. We're working on our own feedback capabilities. Ultimately, we would like to be able to provide individualized feedback annually, but with over 400 reporting entities and essentially 3 of us in the team working on this, it might take some time before we can meet that level of expectation. There is a specific GRS resource you can find online. So that's one of these supplementary resources to the guidance, which specifically looks at instructions for annual reporting. You can look at that if you'd like some additional info on this particular aspect. Next slide, please. This is the aforementioned form. So it's just a little, the top of it, but you can see it's not too complicated here. At this point, we're talking about aggregating your procurement spend across the different levels of due diligence, which you can do in a fairly automated way once you interface with the IRIT. If we could come on to the next slide, please, Lucy. And then it goes on in part B to a series of questions essentially asking you about what you've done to meet the various reasonable steps and sub-steps. And we set out the type of information that we're looking for. Sometimes it's simple as yes, no. Sometimes it's an open a field description. And in a very limited number of cases, we have optional reporting of quantitative data. In future, we may increase the expectation around use of quantitative data. But as I said, that will take some time. We need to develop capabilities first. Next slide, please. Now, how are we going about implementing the guidance? So the guidance took effect on the 1st of January 2024, but as I've said, there's not an expectation of total and complete immediate compliance or implementation. It's a process. What we're looking for is essentially best efforts in these first years, and we recognise, of course, if you're reporting on your activity last year, you didn't have the guidance. So there can't be any expectation that your conduct necessarily aligned with the guidance. If it did, and you can show that, all the better. But we'll certainly factor that into our monitoring activities. We'll continue to provide education and training. We'll have the first multimedia training module available in the next couple of weeks, we think. And we're currently preparing a modern slavery policy guide, which should be available through our website this month. Crossing fingers if everything goes according to plan. That's important because one of the expectations set out in the guidance is that we ask entities in particular to focus on reasonable step 1 in this first year or the first 6 months that the guidance has been in effect, and that includes development of modern slavery policy. Next slide, please, Lucy. So we'll be circulating those resources that I mentioned through our due diligence news and resource distribution list. If you'd like to receive those resources, please whip out your phone or take a screenshot of this QR code. It'll take you to a quick sign up link so that you can sign up to receive all of those resources as they become available. I'll just give you a moment with that. In the meantime, I'm going to explain that there are certain things we'll be focusing on as we conduct our monitoring and that we've encouraged entities to focus on in their implementation. So as I mentioned, reasonable step 1, commit. So that's developing a modern slavery policy and getting it approved by your governing body. It's developing a risk management framework and getting that approved by your senior management. It's salient modern slavery risk analysis. So that's doing essentially a risk mapping of your portfolio to understand which parts of that procurement portfolio or your operations may be most exposed to modern slavery risk. And it's engaging with effective stakeholders. So the parts of the workforce that may be exposed to those risks so that you can keep an eye on how that risk develops over time. The key point here, the first one on this list, is you need to follow the risk. So you've all got limited time and attention. Allocate your work to areas that you identify as the highest risk to people. As I said, there are certain areas that we'll be focusing on this year: ICT and cleaning services, and then we'll be folding in renewable energy, supply chains, and domestic agriculture. Although that may not be too relevant to some of you on the call. What will certainly be more relevant is in 2026, we're going to have a focus on construction. And the reason we flag that now is we want to give you plenty of time, 2 years, to prepare and to be ready to take that on. Construction material supply chains are long and complex. There aren't currently existing frameworks like Cleaning Accountability Framework or Electronics Watch that I mentioned earlier. There aren't really frameworks in place yet for multi-stakeholder action along the, say, steel supply chain or or the interiors supply chain, and yet we know there are real modern slavery risks in some of those textile supply chains. So there's time for you to think about how you're going to tackle that. There is, again, these beautiful lavender boxes. There are already some really good things going on in your organisations we know about through your modern slavery statements, development of modern slavery action plans and roadmaps, and continuous improvement approach to modern slavery. So you're off to a good start. We hope that the guidance and the framework will give you a few more tools and pointers about what the road might look like in the months and years ahead. Next slide, please. I'm just going to stop there before I come on to the codes of practice for a moment. Is there anything about any of the issues we've touched on thus far?
I've got sorry, it's Andrea from Water New South Wales. Just a couple. I love the risk identification tool. That's a great enhancement to the resources. Is there any you're going to do like a gap analysis matrix, so all the requirements of the regional steps and the various acts, so that you can actually assess yourself? Because some of us have been doing reporting action plans for 2 or 3 years, and you get a little bit stale. And I can see from the presentation and having looked at the reasonable steps, there's a few things we just need to sharpen up and just review a little bit to make sure we're fully aligned and there's a bit more context and substance to some of the things we do. But in terms of like all the requirements, is there any like tool you can kind of assess yourself as to help then where the biggest gaps are and where your focus should be as a reporting entity?
We don't offer a ready-made off-the-shelf one, but it's certainly an approach we'd encourage. You could perhaps repurpose the reporting form, Appendix K, for that purpose. Yeah. I mean, it steps you through what have you done on this, what have you done on that. You're going to find out pretty quickly if you start thinking now about how you're going to report in those boxes where you've got it, where you're drawing a blank. So I think that would probably be my suggestion at this point.
Perfect. And just quickly, in terms of the training materials, I think one of the gaps I found, we're pretty good at the, the actual what we should be doing and about modern slavery. I'm just wondering if there's anything about for executive management teams and boards to understand their accountabilities, because I think sometimes it's a bit lost within the organisation when there's an expectation we're all doing these things as a working group. But I think there's a big accountability and knowledge required at that higher level around accountability and understanding what we're doing as an organisation. And I know that I've had a look around and I've been talking, I'm glad to see one of our training development colleagues are on the call, but, to look at that training. But if there's something in train or if it, more generally for all government agencies, that I think that would be really useful to get that top down as well as bottom up approach to modern slavery and the importance of it.
We certainly think that top-down coverage is critical for movement on these issues. Otherwise, frankly, they get crowded out by other things. Also because, and I think this is especially important for all of you on this call, we think that there's potential that this emerges as a fiduciary duty, attention to these issues in the same way that other certain sustainability factors are emerging as something that directors need to be paying attention to. The reason we say that is the number of regulatory and legal avenues for accountability around modern slavery is rapidly extrapolating. Let me just give you a quick few examples. Not only do we have these laws here, and obviously the board has to sign off on your statement, but also we know that, for example, the federal government has committed to introduce, if it wins re-election, a ban on the import of goods made with forced labour. If you think about what that could do to some companies' business model, if they're suddenly unable to source, for example, textiles made with cotton that might contain modern slavery, or solar panels. You remember what I was saying earlier, and I'll come back to in a moment. That could have, really serious material implications for the profitability of a particular company. We see shareholder actions on this taking place worldwide. So we've seen shareholder actions to do with companies' connections to forced labour in companies as big as Apple, Nike, Volkswagen, Audi. In France, there's criminal legal action being brought against Zara and H&M, the retailers, because they're using cotton supplied from Xinjiang, China. So all of these go to quite serious implications for commercial organisations that boards are going to need to be grappling with and getting across. Now, we're not providing a bespoke guidance at this point, but certainly something we're happy to consider as we work forward on training. I would be happy if there were an opportunity for a member of my team to speak with your board about why this is significant and the kinds of things that organisations that take this seriously are beginning to do. And the other thing I would say is that under reasonable step 1, we encourage you to adopt a modern slavery policy that's approved by the governing body. So you're going to have a conversation at board or governing body level there about why are we doing this? Is this just a risk, de-risking and compliance exercise? Or is this actually something that goes to our social license as an organisation and our reason for being? I see a question from Maeve.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, can we just jump back to reporting for a second? Two things. Andrea, just for your reference, because I think that gap analysis question was really handy, and the suggestion of using Appendix K. So I did do that for just measuring our capabilities and our reporting capabilities, just transferring that into an editable form, the guidance, and then looking at the activities we'd undertaken, the information that we've been capturing in our data, and just quickly assessing, yes, no, can we meet this? Do we have evidence of this? I found that really handy. I think we're going to keep that going forward because it will identify future areas that we need to work on year. So, if we haven't assessed areas or focused on certain areas, year over year, then that's going to be a focus area maybe going forward. I found that just really useful to understand where we stood. And then just a question, James, on reporting. Sorry, I got a bit confused. So the online reporting form, and then there's Appendix K, which is kind of the same information. Where do we report that Appendix K to? Is that, do we have to attach that to our annual statement, or do we send that off in an email? I just wasn't sure about that.
So under the Modern Slavery Act, that has to go in your annual report. Now you may want to adopt the format, but we're giving you Appendix K. It may well not reflect the way you approach inclusion of information in your annual report, but that's the statutory obligation. Of course, the other question you're going to be asking yourselves, I'm sure, is, well, hang on, we're already doing a modern slavery statement under the Federal Act. So why do we have to do these two different statements in different form? What I would say to you is I think you may well find a way to combine what we're asking for under Appendix K and what you need to report under the Severin criteria in the federal statement. In fact, there will be a lot of overlap, but you may find there's a format that you can produce annually that hits both marks, and you can just have one document essentially that meets all the requirements, and that would be the single source that is on your website, and you refer to that from your annual report or something like that.
Yeah, thanks. And I think without doing it purposefully, that is how we're kind of transitioning our statement contents to more of a process flow. So that's something I also looked at with the guidance of reasonable steps, just, how, if we're aligned in that sense as well. But yeah, thanks for clearing that up.
Oh, you're welcome. Lucy, could we just put on the screen actually Part B? Because just to clarify for people, it's particularly Part B of Appendix K. So this is just the very top of a long form, essentially. And you see there's a table, the reasonable steps taken, the form of response that should go in your annual reporting, and then whether from our perspective response is mandatory or optional for your annual reporting. And there's a long series of questions. I don't know how many exactly. It's probably about 25, 28, 3 or 4 per 7 for each of the 7 reasonable steps. So that would be what you could use then to go through and conduct your gap analysis. Okay, I've got one more question from Glenda, and then I'm quickly going to talk about codes of practice, and then I think we'll be at time.
Yeah, it's just in relation to Appendix L in regards to the reporting of contracts.
Yes. Is that the heightened modern slavery due diligence reporting?
Yes, which starts on 1 July 24.
So here's the nice second surprise of the afternoon. It will not start on 1 July 2024. We're about to issue an announcement to all parties, making clear that we are postponing that, probably by about a year. We can't make a firm commitment to 1 July 2025, but that gives you an indication of the kind of time. Now, you're welcome to provide information about your heightened modern slavery due diligence contracts, but we've listened to a lot of parties about the need to allow you to do that in a way that's minimally onerous and technologically integrated, if I can put it that way. And we need to get that right.
That's where I was going to go with some questions on that. Thanks very much.
So we will, it's not that we don't want to do it, it's that we want to do it right and make it effective. So we're going to take our time and consult with covered entities over the next year to make sure we land the right. It's really a technological solution that we need to arrive at. So there'll be more from us on that in due course. All right, Lucy, we'll skip back to the codes of practice, please. I wanted to tell you quickly about Section 27 of the Act. This gives me the power to develop codes of practice on identifying and addressing modern slavery risks in supply chains. So everything we've talked about is the guidance that's developed to help public sector entities meet their legal obligations. Section 27 says I have the option, additionally, to develop these codes of practice, which aren't limited to the public sector. They could also speak to private sector conduct. So this is really about promoting good practice. We have two under development. The first is around renewable energy. Why renewable energy? Because as I flagged earlier, we know there are particularly high modern slavery risks in certain parts of the renewable energy sector, and they're really hard to manage. So what's been made clear to us is there's a need for clarification of expectations as to what safe modern slavery risk management looks like in that particular context. So we're working with the Clean Energy Council to develop a code of practice. We're getting close actually to having a draft that we'll be able to release. We think that will happen in about July. It'll be released publicly. We'll have a period of notice and comment, and we're optimistic of having the code of practice up and running by the end of the year. As I said, the focus here will be on driving good practice and supplementing the guidance on reasonable steps. So for public buyers, this will be something that they look at in addition to the guidance when they're procuring from these supply chains. For private entities, there'll be the option to opt in to the code of practice as a market signal of the kinds of approaches they're going to take to managing modern slavery risk here. Like the guidance, it's not a thou shalt not buy approach. It's a, if you're buying these products, they're high risk. So these are the kinds of safeguards you want to put in place to reliably manage. And we think that this is going to begin to crystallize what effective modern slavery risk management looks like in those contexts, which will give greater certainty to buyers, developers, investors, retailers, wholesalers, manufacturers. We're quite encouraged by the response we've seen from market actors so far. Now, I'll just touch in the last 90 seconds on one other. On the next slide, we have a similar process underway. If we can come to the next slide, please. In the area of lending, investing and asset management. I wanted to mention that because there'll be some of you on the call for whom this is also useful. We're just beginning to explore. We've done about a year of consultations with certain financial sector actors in New South Wales, and I have a history of working on those issues more broadly. We're talking to a range of financial sector actors about what a code of practice could address here. And in this area, it's probably likely to be about what action for going beyond minimum practice looks like, particularly around issues such as active engagement and creation and development of investable opportunities to address modern slavery risks and modern slavery drivers, which might connect to things like sustainability-linked financing opportunities. We'll also potentially be looking at opportunities for collaborative learning and practical leadership, which is back to that question from Andrea earlier about whether collaboration is going to be one of the outcomes here as we see good practice developing. I think if we go to the last slide, that's probably it from me. Those are the ways that you can connect with us. We'd love to hear from you anytime. The grs@dcj email address there is a bit of an advice and helpline. So if you're struggling to make sense of some part of the guidance and want to reach out for a conversation about that, you're very welcome to. Thank you so much for the opportunity to meet with all of you today. Are there any final questions before we let you go? If you do need to go, please don't hesitate to push on at this point. But I'd be happy to stick around for a couple more minutes if there are any final questions. Monica?
Hi, so this is probably a bit of a curveball, but just to your last point around the risk of renewable energy. So knowing that, and I know that you've done a whole research piece on that really prevalence of the risk of solar panels coming out of the Uyghur province. Do you think government has a role to play in fast tracking the local production of solar panels or renewable energy solutions to make it less of a risk?
I don't think it's for me to speak to policy questions like that, but what I can say is until there is a reliable alternative supply of slavery-free supply chains, solar panels, buyers in New South Wales will continue to be taking a lot of risk by buying solar panels. So the way that the UN Guiding Principles and indeed our guidance approaches this is it says, do you have leverage in this situation? Well, what would leverage mean here? It would mean exerting pressure over suppliers of solar panels to change their behaviours. In some contexts, you might be able to do that. In all honesty, in the context of how the Chinese government approaches management of minority peoples in Xinjiang, you as buyers have extremely limited leverage. But where you do have leverage, as you're pointing at, Monica, is a conversation with government about what the pathway to alternative supply might look like. So what we would expect to see, I think, under the guidance on reasonable steps, I can't speak to the code of practice because that's still under development, but we'd expect to see some kind of creation and use of collective leverage, including through policy advocacy on this point.
Oh, thank you.
The other thing I might mention in the Landcom context is we've got some interesting work going on now with Homes New South Wales, where we're developing on-site core flutes about accessing support around these issues. So if that's of interest, we should be able to make an announcement and show those fairly soon. And, we're happy to talk to others about similar initiatives. Any last burning questions? It's a lot of information to absorb, so please feel free to take this away, work through it at your own speed, and if you do have questions for us, feel free to reach out on one of those methods that we've just mentioned. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and for your continued attention through such a long session. It's been terrific. You've been a lovely interactive audience. We really appreciate the excellent questions and look forward to continuing working with you in months and years ahead.
Thank you. I'm sure everyone appreciated all that information. It's given us lots of food for thought. So thanks for your time.
Very well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
very much.
you.
Thanks, James.
Thank you.
Thanks, James.